Well, hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's live webinar session. We're delighted to have so many people joining us today, especially for what some might think of as a bit of a dry subject, which is corporate governance and compliance, and really the relationship between corporate governance and compliance and cybersecurity. For anyone that's been to any of our other webinars in this series, which we've been running for the last 4 or 5 weeks around cybersecurity, thanks for joining again, and for first-time visitors, a big thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. We're going to be running this session a little bit differently to the previous ones, if anybody did make those. So rather than this time perhaps bombarding you a bit with PowerPoint slides, as some of the other ones perhaps have been a little bit, we're going to invite you today to listen into more of a discussion on this subject of corporate governance and compliance from a cybersecurity perspective. And you can enter into the discussion as well if you want to, and you can do that by submitting questions through the web console that you should have on screen at the moment. And depending how we go with time, and if sufficient time permits, we'll try to cover as many of your questions today as we can. So I'll introduce the other two guys in a second. First thing, just to let you know that my name is Mark Lee. I'm Business Development Manager, or Director rather, with GCI Group. And prior to this, I've been involved in various roles, including CEO of an IoT software platform company. So from my point of view, this idea of corporate governance and compliance and cybersecurity is something which has been very much part of my own business life, because within that business in particular, we were connecting lots of devices which were in people's homes to a software platform, including even things like cameras, and capturing really personal data. So compliance with things like GDPR was something that I had to live with in my business life, and running that business day to day. And it, I wouldn't say it kept us awake at night, but it was certainly something that we had a lot of concern about. So for today's session, I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Rem Noormohamed. Rem is the CIO and the cybersecurity practice leader to Acuity Law. Acuity Law is a really progressive and modern law firm that's doing some really smart things, I think, around cybersecurity and corporate governance. So Rem, I guess as the CIO of a law firm and a lawyer as well, providing clients with advice and guidance around corporate governance and cybersecurity matters, you've probably got quite an interesting perspective, almost on both sides of the divide there. Is that right?
That is, thanks, Mark, and hello, everybody, and thanks for having me on, and it's great to be here. So yeah, I think I'm very fortunate in the sense that as an advisor, to be able to see it through the eyes of a CIO and a business perspective actually helps to contextualize and frame the advice, obviously, in terms of what the law requires, but actually that sort of pragmatism in real world context to make sure that it gets delivered that way. And certainly as a CIO, I see in terms of the advice that I get from others, obviously, whether it's internally from my team or other professionals, I do expect a certain mode of behavior and approach. So I think it gives me both sides of the telescope.
Yeah, thanks, Rem. And let me say, we really appreciate you joining us today, and I'm personally really looking forward to getting the benefit of your experience and knowledge in this area. So great to have you with us. Thanks. Our other panelist today is Dave Fraser. So Dave is a cybersecurity expert in the GCI team, and I know that in previous lives, Dave's run SOCs for various businesses, including regulated organisations. I think, Dave, you were with IATA for a period. So you've really been at the coalface of trying to ensure ongoing compliance to various corporate governance standards during BAU, which I guess, Dave, sometimes can be more challenging than just getting the badge in the first place.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Mark, and hi, Rem, and hi, everybody else. Yeah, definitely. I mean, fundamentally, from my perspective, my stance has always been very much that it's normally quite easy to get the compliance, as in get the cert, but to manage it on an ongoing basis becomes quite tricky, and that's hopefully what we'll delve into a bit of depth today in terms of what can be done both through GCI and Acuity Law, and just some general advice on the best ways to keep on top of that, so it's not a case of rushing to get a recertification at the last minute.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so, well, look, it sounds as if we've got the technology covered with you, Dave, and Rem giving us some insight into the legal aspects of compliance. So I guess we've got most of the angles covered. So let's kick off. I'm going to pose a question, if that's okay, guys. Be interested to get both your thoughts on this one. And I guess it's just a positioning question, which is, when we say corporate governance and compliance, what do we mean? Is it about the law or standards, or is it something else? And is there one single piece of legislation that we need to think about? Is it as clean cut and simple as that, or is it more nuanced and complex? Maybe one for you, Rem.
Thank you for that. Good question. Certainly to wake me up in the morning. I mean, I think it probably makes sense to set the context first of all. So when we talk about corporate governance, what do we mean? Well, these are usually the internally created imposed rules on a business, policies, procedures, effectively created by the board of directors, seeking to direct, manage, and control the organization. But I think it's important to remember one size doesn't fit all. So that's corporate governance. In terms of compliance, well, compliance is the externally created and imposed set of rules. They usually take the form of mandatory laws or regulation. It's all about, when we talk about compliance, it's all about meeting prescribed minimum obligations and potentially standards too that are set out in the law and beyond. Non-compliance can result in a number of consequences, and I think we have to be mindful of this. You could lose, for example, in the context of a business, certain licenses. You could actually be sued. You may face regulatory fines, or in some cases where you breach aspects of certain regulations or law, there are criminal penalties that will follow. So in addition to those aspects, I think it's worth remembering you also have the fallout, which are things like reputational damage. So corporate governance, internally focused. When we talk about compliance, that's dealing with and complying and conforming to externally imposed rules. Standards, if we cover standards now as well, so at least we see them in context. Standards actually help you achieve compliance. So they're a form or a contribution to compliance in that they provide a framework to enable your compliance effort. Regulators and governments count on standards, the ICO, for example, to ensure actually what we have is better regulation because it's underpinned by a framework that everybody seeks to comply to. So I think those are the fundamental building blocks. Now in the UK, it's not as straightforward as we would like. I mean, there is no such thing as a singular cybersecurity law. So what we have to do is we have to consider the landscape in which business operates. So for example, as there is no one law, what do we turn to? Well, it's, for data, we've got the GDPR and now enshrined within the Data Protection Act 2018 that we have to consider. In terms of directors of the company and governance, they're bound by the Companies Act. In relation to aspects where there is criminal activity in relation to cybersecurity, we look to things like the Computer Misuse Act 1990. If you happen to be an essential provider, energy company, utilities, that sort of thing, or a digital services provider, you're also covered by the NIS regulations. If you're doing a lot of marketing, there are issues around the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations 2003 that you have to bear in mind in terms of communications with third parties, particularly around marketing, and also in the case if there's a breach. If you're a telecommunications operator, you'll clearly have to be compliant with the Communications Act 2003. And finally, as an example, if you happen to be in financial services, you also have to comply with the Financial Conduct Authority's handbook. So what we're seeing is there's a load of different regulations and laws that come into effect, depending on which sector you're in. So you've got to look at cybersecurity from a general perspective, within certain sectors, and against certain criteria. So I think it's really important to remember that you have to look more broadly than one place. One thing to remember actually is that where the law does, or the UK does, impose security obligations on you, the businesses are broadly free and at their discretion to choose what compliance route they want to take. So I think it's always worth remembering it as simply as this. The what is mandatory, the how is discretionary. And cybersecurity, I would say, therefore, is not just about IT, it's about the whole business and risks to the business. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful, actually. And I guess the way I think about this is that some areas of compliance are very directly governed by law. You know, like GDPR, you get no choice. It applies to everybody, regardless of what business you're in. Others do relate much more specifically to verticals, so maybe something like, I don't know, FCA or PCIDSS, which are, you know, vertically or service specific. And others are, I guess, much more discretional, like perhaps ISO 27001, where it's a badge you as a business decide you want to have because it lets you enter a market or says something about your business that your market, your customers can take confidence in. So it's, I guess what we're really saying is it's quite a nuanced landscape that we need to think about here. And that, you know, when you look at that, where do you start? And are there any tools or systems that we can maybe lean on that might help us to navigate the, you know, where we stand and where we might and how we might approach the business of compliance? Did
you want me to say that one, or Dave?
Well, both of you really. I mean, I don't know. Whatever you think. It seems like quite a broad subject. So yeah, interested to hear from both of you on that, I think.
I'll jump in for a second, Mark. So so if we draw out something specific, which we've spoken at length about recently, is if you look at something like PCIDSS, you've got a requirement under PCIDSS to be checking your logs on a frequent basis. And Rem can obviously talk to the consequences of not doing that, because he's obviously the expert in that area. But from my probably rather more simplistic perspective of logging into a device, so you've got a requirement for anything inside that scope to be reviewing the logs for the firewalls, the switches, the routers, the servers. Now, the terminology under the standard is very specific, but it doesn't necessarily have a technical approach. So the specificity of it is really about the fact that you must go and check these logs on a frequent basis. The reality of that is, if you're checking firewall logs on a frequent basis, you're going to have, you know, hundreds of thousands of logs a day on an external facing firewall. And by, you know, downloading it in a CSV and checking in Excel, strictly speaking, you would have adhered to that compliance standard because you have reviewed it, but you haven't necessarily taken that standard to heart and done what needs to be done. And therefore, if something were to go wrong, and the consequence that Rem can speak of was to happen, you'd struggle to argue that you really have done what they asked you to do. And that's where technologies like SIEM come in, where effectively the review of the logs is fully automated. So you're feeding those logs from the Windows servers, Linux boxes, routers, firewall switches, and anything else inside that sphere, that scope, directly into a SIEM platform. And the SIEM platform then effectively analyzes those logs, collates them, aggregates, and it then triggers in what we call interesting events. So security events that need somebody to do something. And by implementing a SIEM platform, you effectively remove, you know, quite a significant proportion of that log checking responsibility because you're pushing it into a software stack. We also have the concept of watch points ourselves with our managed security services. We have watch points which marry up with the security service, where we then kind of step further into that, and we go and do the reviews of whether the firewall config is correct. So we're checking whether rules are too permissive or not. These are obviously key things that have to be done. And again, hopefully Rem can cover off what happens if you don't. But the reality of that is that these activities need to be scheduled. They need to be done on a frequency that's in line with the standard. And this really kind of goes across. I mean, PCI is a nice example of it because it's very specific, but you have the same thing with ISO and, you know, FCA, and you know, there's various technical requirements around logs, logging, collection of logs, retention of logs, and then something like a SIEM platform kind of is a nice umbrella that covers all of that for you. Is kind of what I'm saying there.
And Red, but in terms of, you know, I don't know, maybe some other standards, is there any way that you can assess where you sit relative to that standard, maybe at the outset or something like that? But maybe, I don't know, from Acuity's point of view, do you have any tooling that could help with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a couple of points I will make there. So again, sort of standing back and thinking about it, there are three areas that we want to look at when we're looking around the whole aspect of compliance. I think we've got to look at our people, and we've got to look at our processes, And then we've got to look at our technology and utilize the technology, as David has indicated, to actually give us an insight as to what is actually going on and responding. I think looking at those three aspects, I think what we need to be doing, all businesses need to be doing, including my own, is we ought to, from a cybersecurity and a GDPR perspective, be regularly auditing our systems, our processes, our policies, our procedures, and ultimately our people, making sure that they are properly trained and understand actually what the law is. I mean, my standard that I will bang on about, even though I do happily chat about 27001 and PCI because I'm an engineer as well as a lawyer, but the most important, the tool that I use is actually what is enshrined in law. And ultimately, we have to comply with the law, and that standard, as we've said, is non-negotiable. So the key thing for us is to make sure that we are regularly, and we obviously at Acuity have developed a tool called DataGuard, which is an audit tool. So we actually work with our clients to understand, as part of their process, where are they? Let's take a benchmark as to where they are now, and we'll do an audit of their business, and we'll then use the tool to be able to identify, what the on a RAG status, the reds, the ambers, and the greens, where the key issues and priorities are. We'll also work with them once we've got that to work with the board and inform them of strategy and approach. The key thing is whoever's helping you understand what is happening where you are now, understand whether you are bang on the mark in terms of your regulatory and legal compliance, but also your standards compliance. Do a gap analysis, and then effectively update your processes, your policies, and make sure you do it regularly, and your procedures. Remember, your business changes, your suppliers change, your suppliers' businesses change. Look at not only what happens within your business, but all those that touch your business. And I think the key thing there is, you not only have to look at that within the context of where your business is going and how it's adopting technology or how it's innovating itself, but actually you need to ensure that you're keeping up to date with the threats. And so you've got to always have a weather eye on things that are outside your control. And as David said, you've got to be looking for signals, issues in those logs that are causing you concern. So I think that's the most important. Test and implement, continually monitor, assess yourself, and be honest in that assessment, or bring in others to assess your business on effectiveness, because otherwise, if you are not doing those things, ultimately we all take insurance and we rely on the fact that we've got insurance. Sometimes we get a bit complacent with it, but all those insurance policies, whether it's for cyber or generally for our business, directors and officers liability or corporate liability, we have to make absolutely certain that we comply with the obligations put upon us by the insurers too. Otherwise, in a horrible world, we might find, or in the real world, we might find horribly that they're void. They won't cover us for those aspects. Sure. So those, I think, are the key factors that come in. I think the thing that we just can't control is how quickly the attack vectors will change and new vulnerabilities will come into play. But in those instances, it's all about how we adapt and how we react. And I think this comes back to the point that David was making, and continuous monitoring, which I think you guys will talk about as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we don't have an enormous amount of time today, and I'm super conscious that some of the subjects we're talking about we're doing in a relatively superficial way, just because of the time constraints. And we are getting questions coming in, so we'll move on to some of those in a second. But just to say, I guess it goes without saying, if anybody does want to get into a more detailed discussion on any of the things we're talking about today with Acuity or with GCI, please do reach out. We've got, we're here and we're very, very keen to pursue these discussions with you. But if we just think about, so we talked a little bit there about the importance of compliance and some of the risk factors of failing to take this seriously. I just wonder, Rem, is there any sense in which you might think, well, what I don't know can't hurt me, and that ignorance of what's going on might actually be helpful in defence? In other words, do I really want to look under the bonnet and see that I've got a bit of an oil leak, or am I better just ignoring it and carrying on?
Yeah, well, that's certainly an approach, not necessarily the right approach. I mean, ignorance, unfortunately, is not bliss. It's no defence in the eyes of the law, as we know, as the phrase goes. And certainly when it comes to data security, and particularly around GDPR and other legislation, there is no excuse. If you have a minimum requirement that's placed upon you, and that's mandated, then there's really nowhere to hide. You have to comply or face the consequence. So really good example, data breach, you bury your head, You hope it'll go away. You don't bother to report it, and clearly it has a significant impact on the data subjects, but you don't bother to inform them or the ICO. Well, the consequence of that, if you have a complaint into the ICO and they investigate and find you to be in fault, is that they will and can, well, they can and will impose a penalty up to 2% of your global turnover, or 10 million, whichever is the greatest. So it will hurt. Just like if you run a car and you're out of oil, you have to buy a new engine. It's painful.
Yeah, sure. And Dave, I mean, and a similar thing, I guess. I was talking with somebody else about this the other day, and they likened an unidentified data leak a little bit like a pipe leaking under a floorboard in terms of the damage that it can do. So I guess time in this sort of stuff is of the essence. Is there anything, any advice you've got around how you might stay on top of this sort of stuff and prevent that leaking pipe?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, kind of to bounce off Rem's point, but from the technical perspective, when there's and obviously your analogy is quite apt there. The reality of the situation is, if you've been breached, if say you're in a scenario where somebody's got into your Office 365 estate and they're kind of nestled into that, as they're nestled into that estate, because they've effectively got more insider knowledge, they can then move laterally across your estate. So the problem then becomes, you might end up with an initial breach where an individual's account has been compromised, but then the attacker effectively uses that account to spread across the organization. So you might have started with a breach, maybe on the IT help desk. So you've got some customer information there. That then might spread to the HR department. And in that scenario, then you're talking about a far more significant breach in terms of the GDPR element, because you've got personal information that's stored, and maybe people have been sending their passports as pictures in to, as they've been employed. Details of people's medical records, those sorts of things are often kind of left in those emails, and they're not really cleared down more often than not. In terms of what you could do to be a bit more proactive about it, there's various dark web monitoring tools, and obviously, without wanting to pitch too much, we've obviously got one in-house ourselves. And what that's really doing is it's you implement a data set into the monitoring tool, and then as that data gets posted onto the dark web or a paste bin, effectively there's a proactive alert. And this covers you from both the REM perspective of you've got to deal with it, and you've got to deal with it effectively because there's a standard, and also from the technical perspective of the lateral movement, because if somebody's using a paste bin to drop that data, if you can see that they've got that data, so that person's username and password, or that person's personal information that they've taken out of that account and dropped onto the dark web, or onto a paste bin so that they can access it later, obviously that means you can react more quickly. So that means you're ahead of the curve, and from the REM and ICO perspective, you can then get your ducks in a row, make sure you know what's happened, and Rem can obviously talk in far more detail than I'll ever be able to on that. But from the technical perspective, obviously, if you can stop that earlier on, the damage is less, and therefore the risk is less.
Yeah.
Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does, and I think this is right, that from an ICO perspective, once you get to 30,000 pieces of personal data being stolen, then they would consider that to be a major breach. And you think, well, 30,000, that's an enormous. But actually, if you think, and I am aware of some cases where businesses have had their entire email compromised, where they've got lots of email forwarding rules set up in their 365, for example, mail's being forwarded out of the business. There's an awful lot of personal data often in corporate emails, even though you might not think there is. And if somebody has got that kind of that hooks into you and it's going away, I guess something like that dark web monitoring thing that you've talked about, and other things you could do around regularly checking. They might not be proactive in the sense of stopping it happening, but knowing more quickly means that the scale of the problem is containable. So I guess it's this kind of thing you should do regularly.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, go on, sorry, Ray.
I mean, I think the key thing I would say, just to sort of just cover also what you're saying, I think the most important thing is every business should have an incident response plan. I mean, that's fundamental. And in that plan, there must be a response team covering IT, operations, legal, PR, marketing, the CIO, and there must be a very clear set out of roles and responsibilities, checklists, processes, templates, and the business must also identify, it's quite fundamental, a incident lead coordinator to ensure the overall response is coordinated and dealt with properly. That plan has to be tested regularly. So when you do have an issue, when it does go wrong, you can assemble, like the Avengers, assemble the incident response team, identify the breach. Is it online? Is it offline? Is it physical? Is a laptop being stolen and a data leakage there? Investigate and contain comes back to David's point. Impact assessment. What is the impact? What are we going to do? How are we going to do? What are the triggers, ramifications? Right, there's a point around recovery now. How do we recover as a business to make sure we can hit BAU? Part of that will also be notifications and communications. We've got to have a strategy as a business. We've got to know what that is. We've got to understand the templates that go with it in terms of press statements, maybe prepare a prepared FAQ. We're going to have to think about notifying individuals and regulatory bodies. It could be the ICO, obviously for data breach. We may have obligations under PCI and in accordance with the Financial Services Authority. We may have to also report to the FCA. Once we've done all that, I think we have to come back and we then have to evaluate and improve. I think we've got to learn from those experiences. Now, clearly, in terms of when it does go wrong and there is an issue in terms of personal data, where there is a personal data breach, we've got to look at this and define it in a really simple way, which is it broadly defines a security incident that has effect on, classic cybersecurity language, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of personal data. And whenever there is a breach that results in loss, destruction, corruption, or disclosure of that personal data, that is what triggers a security breach or data breach, and that is what we have to think about. Now, when that occurs, we then have to think very carefully about this test, the likelihood and severity of the resulting risk to people, the data subjects' rights and freedoms. We've got to focus on the potential negative consequences, the adverse effects on those individuals according to recital 85 of GDPR. So if we've done that test, and in that test we identify actually there is a strong likelihood, your example for instance, and the severity is quite significant, then actually we have a duty to notify the Information Commissioner's Office within 72 hours. Now, if we decide that we're not going to do that, this is important, we still have to keep a documented justification for it. So in the event that actually they receive a complaint, we can actually say, look, we did the impact assessment, we went through this process, and we determined, acting reasonably and sensibly, that there was nothing to report. Now, and we get asked regularly, what if, sorry, just to finish off, I'm conscious of time too, what if we haven't got all the information? Do we sit back until we have all the information? And the answer is no. Report within the 72 hours, say you're still investigating, we're still trying to get that information, but make sure in a timely way, without any further delay, the ICO requires, that you provide those updates. Sorry, Mark.
No, I think they're really important points you make. With the ICO, Rem, is there any sense to which they are, rigid? This is the way it is. This is what the law says. You don't care whether you tried or whether you've done your best. Doesn't matter. Or are they more sympathetic than that?
I mean, certainly talking to the ICO since we went into lockdown and we saw that huge spike, 400% to 700% increase in the amount of cyber attacks. What they recognize is actually lots of businesses are under a lot of pressure, particularly with lockdown and where we are with COVID. Their view is very much the fact that, look, you have the minimum requirements, you should be trying to do the very best you can do, and they are sympathetic. But the most important message that has come through time and time again is, if you're not sure, it is better to pick up the phone and they have a helpline number, or do the online checklist that they've got to determine whether you should or shouldn't be reporting. They would far rather you put your hands up, as we've done with a few of our clients, and said, look, we believe there's an issue, we feel it's borderline, but we are making a notification to you. Sure. They have looked at it and said, look, we're far happier for those situations than people saying, oh no, it's all right, don't worry about it, we're okay, because everybody else is in the same boat. Coming back to your ignorance point, because as soon as they have a complaint, they have to then abide by the law. There's no discretion, and they will look to identify what you have or haven't done. And they're less.
Sorry, Rem, be proactive, you know, bite the bullet, don't bury your head in the sand, basically. I'm super conscious of time. We've got a number of questions that have come in. I'm going to just do one quick one. Before I do that, just to say for anybody that's found this useful and is interested in future sessions, we've got another one in 2 weeks' time on PCI compliance specifically, so look out for that. Dave, final question. We're over time, but I'm going to give it you anyway. What do businesses typically do when they've been breached, and any learnings from what you've seen that might be good approaches in that situation?
Yeah, so more on that often than not, and quite understandably, it turns into a bit of a finger pointing exercise. So fundamentally, a breach has normally occurred because there's some form of vulnerability, something hasn't been hardened, locked down, a firewall rule's too permissive. The reality of those scenarios are normally it's a case of an engineering team is effectively doing their best to ensure that something works. And effectively, with security and availability kind of being opposite ends of the spectrum, you can often end up in a scenario to get something working, you might make a firewall rule too permissive. So you're allowing too much through. And then you've exposed a vulnerability, and that's then been exploited. So effectively, that attack kill chain. Now, the reality of that is that you've got the fact that the server was probably missing a patch, so the systems guys were to blame. The network wasn't secured properly, so the firewall guys were to blame. The compliance guys didn't run the vulnerability assess frequently enough, so they're to blame. So the reality is there's so many fingers that can be pointed that you end up in this circular argument of whose fault is it. And the reality is it's the fault of the business, not really the individuals. The finger can only really get pointed up. And this is why you should really be looking at third parties to be doing assessments on you, and kind of what Rem said. It's about having somebody check your homework and make sure that you're doing things right. What I would say in terms of one of the advantages of outsourcing, so using our cert team or one of our competitors' cert team, is by outsourcing it, you effectively remove that finger pointing. You turn it into an exercise of how do we fix this, how do we stop it from happening again, and how do we give the ICO, if we need to go down that route, confidence that these steps are being taken to make sure it doesn't happen again. And then you can then kind of do a drains up at the end where you say, right, well, this firewall was too permissive, this server didn't have a patch, but you can move more towards we can blame an individual or a group of individuals or a subset of the business, or what we can say is there's a lesson to be learned, and the lesson to be learned needs to be around the fact that we should be picking these things up proactively going forwards, and therefore the business then needs to place an investment in those proactive toolkits, and whether that's in-house or through third parties. And that kind of feeds back into the kind of the Acuity Law piece as well, of you don't know what you don't know. So if you're not doing some form of auditing with regards to what are your obligations and what are the best practices, you're going to be blind to the fact that if you don't know that you need to do patch management, well, there's no point complaining at somebody about patch management. It becomes a moot point. Go on, sorry.
Perfect. No, I was just going to say, so I guess to summarize that, if you have been breached, the message is forget about whose fault it is, deal with the problem, and then afterwards think about how you prevent what you need to do to prevent a recurrence. And yeah, I think you're probably right. Getting externals to help with that takes all of the personality and the finger pointing and I guess the emotion out of it. So I think yeah, I agree with you. I think that's great advice. We've overrun. Thanks to everybody that's come today and stayed with us over time. Really appreciate it. As I mentioned, we've got another session in a couple of weeks. If that's of interest to you, we'd love to have you join us again. Thanks, Rem. Brilliant advice. Really appreciate your time you spent with us this morning. And Dave, thanks for your insights as well. And we'll see you all again soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.